Welcome to the Herberger Online office hours for the summer of 2020, where we bring together instructional designers and faculty to talk about relevant issues in online teaching and higher ed. And we're excited today to have Randy Rebman and Justin Shewell. Randy, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Randy Rebman, and I'm assistant professor at St. Louis University, where I teach a number of academic skill courses to international students.
Hi, I'm Justin Shewell. I work in Herberger Online with Tim as an educational technologist at Arizona State University.
And I'm Tim McKean. I didn't introduce myself that time. I'm an instructional designer with Herberger Institute for Design in the Arts at Arizona State University. And today we took a look at a video interview on the Stallman podcast show with Alex Lindsay. Alex Lindsay is one of the world's experts in producing live video and live streaming events. And while it wasn't necessarily education focused, Alex does have a heart for education, a passion for education. And I think there are a lot of things that we can take from other areas of industry. And that's one of my favorite kind of approaches to see what different industries are doing, like the entertainment industry, like sports industry, or business, or other places, and see what aspects of those kind of things we can bring in to enhance the student teaching and learning experience. What were some of the things that you guys noticed, or was there a primary thing that stood out to you from what Alex was talking about with live streaming video production?
I guess I'll jump in. So I watched the first 20 minutes, and I remember looking at how he was interviewing Jared for a little while. Jared Stein was kind of mentioning some different models. And then he kind of started talking about just different ways of approaching faculty instruction. So that was kind of where I kind of left off on it. But one of the things that I guess I always took away from it was just how the different, I guess, models that teachers were looking at in terms of trying to leverage their own training to get on board with kind of the high flex model, and how there was so many different things thrown out. And I guess what kind of made me curious about it is just like how leaders, whether it's instructional designers or within departments, can provide the means for that kind of work relationships to take place, that collaboration, that sharing of knowledge and expertise. Like obviously you're doing right now, but like how does that happen within a department or across campus? And so that's one of the things that after looking at all these methods, I'm like, wow, how do you approach that from a leadership perspective?
Yeah. And I think, Randy, not to throw you under the bus, but I think you watched something different than what I was talking about. But your comment is absolutely correct. And Ben was on this call a couple weeks ago, and we used to talk about the idea that professional development is just about enabling the conversation. Once you get the conversation started, we have no problem talking to each other and sharing ideas. And every time I talk to a teacher or an instructional designer, there's a good chance that there's going to be one or two things that come up, like a new tool or a new technique or a new resource for research or a journal. And sometimes, like you said, the format for this conversation is, I've been sending out a resource to watch or read, and then we kind of come to talk about it. I'm almost thought about kind of doing away with the resource and just having it be Q&A driven. But just having people come together and talk, and the value of having you, Randy, here, Justin and I talk to each other most every day. But having Randy come, having other people from other units in ASU, having Ben come from Spokane, and some of the other people that have come from different schools is so valuable, because you bring a different perspective and a different set of challenges, a different set of use cases and things like that. So yeah, absolutely. Just finding ways to provide the framework for that conversation to take place. And I think people sometimes overthink professional development. Like, I have to have this webinar planned, or I have to have a textbook or some kind of professional development curriculum. And really, you don't. You just need a reason to show up together. You just need a reason to talk. And once you have enough reason to talk, things happen.
Yeah, I was just looking at your resources. I watched the online, on-site, and everything in between webinar capture instead of the one that I was supposed to.
Oh, very cool.
I did the wrong homework.
No, that's awesome. That was a good workshop too. So the interview with Alex Lindsay, I've watched it a few times. I was hoping to review it just before this, but I had another workshop to be at. One of the things that I think is a important conversation for us to have as educators and as instructional designers is how we're using live events and why we're using live events. And in fact, can I do this without breaking things? Probably not. Alex has 3 reasons that he says that it's valuable to go live. And again, Alex's job, his company, 090 Media, that's their job, is to produce live events, whether it's political rallies. They did a lot of events for Google back in the day. And I think he says he's up to about 2,000 live events that he's produced. And he works with like Fortune 50 level companies. He did a lot of the live event production for the Obama White House. And, so he's working at that level, which is a little bit different than the level and the budget and the equipment that we have. But it was interesting to hear his viewpoint when clients come to him and say, hey, we want a live stream. We want to produce a live event. He'll ask them why. Why do you think you need this to be live? And what are the values? So he has 3 things. Breaking news is important to be live. Sports are important to be live because, you want to know who won. You want to, you don't want that spoiler of, you don't want to watch a game from yesterday. You want to know right now. So that, capturing and showing a live thing that's happening, and audience engagement. And I think from our perspective, we probably have very little breaking news happening in our class, right? Unless you are, I don't know, unless you're maybe have a political science class, there's a lot of like current events type stuff that you could bring in to your lectures that you really just need to have really up to date, really evergreen information. That's not the right term. Really fresh information. We don't, sports is an entertainment thing. So unless you're, I don't know, there might be some use cases where sports were involved in a lecture or in a class lesson. But I think the primary reason for us to have any kind of live event is that audience engagement, is the getting your participants involved more than you are, I think. Anything other than that can be done asynchronously as effectively or sometimes even more effectively. What are your thoughts on that, Randy? How are you using? Remind me, I don't remember your situation, if you're teaching completely asynchronous or using in-person classes.
So this summer, the class I'm teaching it has 1 weekly synchronous session, and that's kind of scheduled in since we're kind of a small department, and with the other teachers that also have the same students, because it's a language program, probably very similar to, I think ASU still has is it the ACP, the culture program? I don't know if it's changed
Maybe
now.
That became Global Launch. That's where I used to work before I came to Herberger Online.
Okay. Yeah, I had colleagues that worked there. So it's probably a very similar program to that. So some other teachers will have maybe a weekly Zoom session that's on Thursday, and mine's on Tuesdays in the morning from like 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. And so we'll have one of those synchronous sessions, and then everything else is asynchronous. And then there's always an option for individual student meetings. And so that's kind of the way ours has been set up this summer.
Mm-hmm. Justin, you're also in the classroom. Tell us a little bit about how you balance the synchronous and asynchronous components of your course.
Well, I have the advantage of coming to my class as an instructional designer and an educational technologist. So, I mean, I guess if I had to, I could teach my course entirely online. The course well, and I teach several different courses, or I have taught several different courses. The course I'm focusing on right now is a web design course. So, it's a skills-based course, and they have assignments that they complete outside of class that show me that they are able to do those skills. So the bulk of my instruction is not really, it's more of a flipped classroom style. It's not really me teaching them how to do something. It's they look at the book, they look at the slides that that go with the book, they figure it out, they come to class with their questions. So for me, the engagement is really key. But I can do that in a Zoom session as well as I can do that in the classroom. If I'm answering individual questions, I'd be going around and, you know, talking to one student here and then going to the next student, sitting next to them and looking at their code. And I do that either with breakout rooms in Zoom or that kind of a thing. And the students who don't need that don't come, or after I've kind of answered the general questions that they might have, then those students leave, and I might have 5 or 6 students left that have specific questions on their code. For me, one of the biggest issues with doing kind of the synchronous Zoom sessions, or trying to record especially, has been bandwidth, internet connection. And you'll get somebody who's speaking who their audio is choppy, or they get disconnected in the middle of a thing. And so, as much as I can, if it's like a lecture or that kind of thing, for me, I would pre-record it. And even if they're watching it live because I'm doing Q&A or something, that type of sort of information delivery, I guess I would prefer to do pre-recorded, and then figure out a different modality if needed to do the live part of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up that idea of pre-recording something but then playing it live during a synchronous session, and that's an interesting concept, and still really valuable in a lot of ways, because it, for one, I found that when I do that, it gives my voice a little bit of a break, right? I just did right before this a 1-hour webinar with 250 faculty and staff from ASU, and I had, I think, just one or two different videos in there, and that gave me a little bit of a break. I could get a drink of coffee. I could kind of scroll through the Q&A, the chat, and kind of see how things were going. And it gave me a chance to kind of reset my brain of, okay, now we've got this much time left, and I, here's the things I want to get to next. And I just found that really valuable, and I've always liked that tempo shift, that when I can say, okay, we're gonna learn about this, and now let this person talk about it on the screen, and I think that changes the rhythm of the engagement as well, especially if you can bring in experts. I mean, if I can just have it was what I showed just now in the workshop was 1.5 minutes of it was Alex Lindsay, who was talking about going live, and it was just, again, it was literally 1 minute and 33 seconds a clip, but it was enough of a break, and I think it changes the rhythm of the experience a little bit. I also think it was interesting what you said, Justin, about how typically you would go student to student and kind of look at their code and give them some feedback on their work. And in fall, with social distancing expectations in place, that's actually going to be harder in person than it would be remotely. So in some cases, it'll be interesting. There's still a lot of ambiguity about what, to say this carefully, a lot of ambiguity about what students will do in fall. ASU has put out some guidelines about what they're going to be offering and kind of what options will be available. But if we're giving students a lot of choice in how they're going to engage in courses, we don't know what they're going to choose. And so that's part of the interesting challenge in preparing for fall. But it would seem to me that as things smooth out, or as things kind of level out a little bit once fall gets started, that a lot of students will realize that the remote, if they have an instructor that does a good job with remote, that remote can actually be a very engaging and very personalized experience, and in some cases maybe even better than the in-person experience is or was. Certainly with social distancing and mask requirements and other kind of things in place, if I were a student, and again, this is going to probably vary based on the skill level of the instructor and their comfort with the technology. But if I can get the same or better experience at home, I'm going to stay home.
Well, and I noticed, so when I was doing it, because I taught the course from January to about March before COVID happened and we went remote. And so when I was in the classroom, I'd be focused, everybody's working on their projects and their assignments, and I'm helping one student who has a specific question. And the other students really aren't paying attention to what I'm saying to this one student because they're looking at their computer screens and doing their thing. And then in the Zoom sessions, I noticed that oftentimes I'd end up answering 2 or 3 students' questions who'd hung around because they had the same question and they could see the other person's screen because they're sharing it in the Zoom room. And so there was a lot more engagement that way. Instead of them waiting for their turn, I was actually able to kind of work with more students at once because often, they often had similar types of questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I went to Alex's office hours on, I don't remember which day it was.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was on Tuesday or something. And one of the things that I think it might have been another session I went to, but they use kind of like a live polling thing, to get engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had mixed success with that depending on the situation, but and Zoom has this feature in their, I think it's in their webinar versions. I don't know if it's in I haven't used it, but
Right.
be able to ask a question and have people submit their answers and then show the results right there. Similar to the way that we might use clickers in a
Right.
live classroom. So maybe doing those types of things can also be used effectively to add student engagement and, like you said, Tim, kind of give them a break from just watching somebody give a lecture or whatever. So
Right. No, yeah. So the office hours that Justin's referring to is Alex Lindsay, again, has every morning he meets together with a group of industry professionals in media production, and they have a Q&A session essentially from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. And they stream it out to YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. Just search Alex Lindsay office hours. And it's also a Zoom call. And if you look in the description on the YouTube video, you'll find that link there. And he has up to usually between 300 to 500 participants in his Zoom call, and usually about 25 to 40 panelists on the screen. And he has very regimented ways that he chooses who's a panelist. You have to be there, by 6:30. You have to do a mic check at 6:45. You have to make sure you have good video and audio, and so that he knows that his panelists all represent the brand, so to speak, and have good, a good setup. But anybody can ask questions in the Q&A tool. And you're right, Justin, that's a Q&A tool that is part of the Zoom webinars tool. And so, but I just did a presentation with Google Slides, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if I can. And so there's this tool called Speaker Tools per Presenter Tools. Audience tools. And so if you bring that up, then you can actually start a new Q&A session.
mm-hmm.
And what this does is on your slide, it gives a link that people can go to and they can ask a question. And then within that tool, when people ask a question, it shows up here in this panel. And then they can actually even vote up and vote down questions. So, and I did that in a workshop today, and it actually went pretty well. I just learned about this tool after going and looking for it, after seeing how well it was working in Alex's environment. But so I really like that idea of giving very specific ways for audience engagement, and having some rules in place, just like we do in the classroom, and saying, here's how you can, here's the appropriate way to engage. And for some people, a chat room is just too open. I was at another webinar recently where there was a lot of activity in the chat room, which is completely normal. And some people that were new to that format were kind of feeling overwhelmed. Like, how am I supposed to pay attention to all this stuff and watch the webinar? And it's an interesting and valuable conversation to have as an instructor. Are you expected to watch the chat and respond to everything in the chat, or things like that? Randy, do you use a back channel, a chat stream, when you're doing synchronous Zoom sessions?
So I do use the Zoom chat a little bit. I've actually started using Nearpod. I don't know if you're familiar with Nearpod, but that's kind of been my solution for synchronous sessions this summer. I played around with it a little bit, and what I've been kind of doing for my synchronous sessions is I'll have a couple slides that I'll import Google, like a Google slide deck, into Nearpod, and then I'll space out maybe a couple of open-ended writing questions just to kind of start it off with students, and then from there usually I have some type of a little bit of presentation of material, and then I actually have them do some type of analysis activity since it's a writing class. And most of the time I'm just throwing them into a breakout room for them to work on that. And then I use the collaborate function in Nearpod too for them to post their answers, kind of like a pair share or gallery walk.
For those that don't know, can you give a little bit more background on Nearpod?
Sure. Yeah, I can actually share my screen if you want me to just show a little bit about kind of how I'm using it. If that
works. Let me open that up for you.
Okay. So this is kind of once you go into Nearpod in the editor, you can basically just create your own lesson, or you can import a lesson from Google Slides. And so I'll just show you, let's see, last week or week 4, I did writing conferences. Let's see if I can do this. And so when you made kind of a class lesson, let's say, you have a link that you can just send to students. And so I send this link into the chat for Zoom, and students can join directly. And then I'll kind of show the preview real quick. So just like a normal, kind of went too far, like a normal lesson, I'll give kind of an agenda, and this just shows a little bit of what we're doing. And then...
and so if we went to nearpod.com right now with that little code, UXNYH, we could join and see your slides, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And as I'm going through this, it would kind of constrain you. So right now you would only be able to look at this corkboard where you would have to post your comments. And so it basically controls the activities that they're working on through the screen. And as the teacher, I just basically share my screen like I am now. So they're seeing the teacher view. And so they're seeing a slightly different kind of student view for them to work on stuff. And like if this is a collaborative activity, they would go in, this is a summary response essay, where I'm asking them to kind of look at my rubric and figure out, how they would judge their essay just by looking at the rubric. And so I send them into the breakout room, and then every once in a while I might send an update on the time limit. You can actually set a time limit within Nearpod. And you can, like, using a little time here to let them know, like, you only have 8 minutes for this activity. And then after that, I'll usually go inside the Zoom breakout room and kind of meet with them and talk about, where they're at, or I'll bring them back into the main room and have them kind of share for that. And so here's the rubric. You can also send PDFs and embed those into that. And then here is the activity for, what is one thing you want your teacher to help you on in your essay, so then they can fill out their answers. And then the student just goes in here like, Tim, there's your. And so after someone puts their answer in here, then I can click on this, and then usually I turn it over and I would say, Tim, can you tell me a little bit about, what part of learning to outline that you would like some help on?
Very cool.
And then, that gives them a chance. And one of the things working with English language learners, and Justin, I'm sure you're probably familiar with this too, and I'm sure you too, Tim, is just that kind of right to learn activity. Instead of just on the spot, I want you to give me some information right now. I think especially just giving them some time to work on their own, and usually I'll just mute myself, kind of disappear, let them work on that, and then come back in. And that kind of provides them a little bit of rest, kind of like Tim, you were talking about earlier, for you to kind of be off camera and not be on all the time. Mm-hmm. So I've used that I feel like that's been working well for me. And then you can share that back with people in the group. There's that timer I was talking about. Mm-hmm. And then usually I'll have like a slide to split it up. And so it'll be like, okay, now that our conference is over, we're going to move on to do this part, to talk about some changes you're going to do. And then I'll have another open-ended question here for like, what are your plans? What do you plan to take away? Mm-hmm. So that's usually kind of way a lesson usually works. I'll have a couple of collaborate activities within the lesson, and then I'll have kind of a takeaway exit ticket. And I just like having that, kind of what you mentioned earlier with Alex's video, is just like trying to have everything kind of controlled, kind of a little more regimented,
right?
Synchronous session. And so I've been working on that. I think it's been a work in progress, but that's kind of how I've been using this tool a little bit.
Yeah, I like it. And I think that as we get more comfort, a lot of teachers have been thrown to digital tools really quickly in the spring. But it'll be interesting to see the scaling and the leveling that happens this fall as people start to develop more comfort and find all the different ways to engage students virtually, remotely, in real time, and asynchronously. And so it'll be fun to watch that. And you're right that there is value there in having those structures, having rules, having class procedures. I started teaching in middle school and as a K-12 teacher for 15 years before moving into instructional design in higher ed. But that's one of the first things as a classroom K-12 teacher, it's really all about those classroom procedures. There are whole courses on classroom management, and the difference between procedures and discipline plans and all those other kind of things. And the more routines you can have and the more structures you can have, a lot of people think that structures are limiting, but a lot of the times structures allow for creativity. They allow for learning to happen. They allow for other good things to happen within them. Recently, I've been seeing the concept of, is it Maslow,
yeah.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And just this idea that as humans, we have a hierarchy of needs. Shelter, food, rest, things like that, safety, are very, very high on the hierarchy of needs. Other things are lower. And as we look at those, we can see that until a student feels safe, until a student has food, until a student is, not cold, their brain is not going to be learning, how the apostrophe S works. That's much lower on the hierarchy of needs at that moment. And that that's kind of evolved into where our modern schoolroom is now with, so many meal plans and other kind of things that a lot of people say those are social programs. Those aren't education. And and there's a point to that too. But at the same time, we've acknowledged that if students have anxiety, if students have needs that are higher on that hierarchy, then their brain isn't processing where we need them to be processing. And I think on a smaller scale, classroom management procedures and routines fit into that conversation. If 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 you're unsure how to participate, if there's that level of anxiety of, am I allowed to talk while he's on the microphone? Am I allowed to turn on my camera? Am I if there's any ambiguity about how to engage, chances are they won't.
Right.
Or if they do, then it brings into all that like social inequities and different cultural and racial inequities too. Of if there are certain cultures that feel more empowered to interrupt than others, there are certain cultures that are not comfortable being on camera versus others, and those kind of things. And so having those expectations and those routines and procedures in place, even in virtual and asynchronous environments, helps to level the playing field and reduce some of that anxiety about how to engage.
Yeah, I was going to bring up, you kind of hit on part of it, but it provides the safety and takes away a lot of that uncertainty about, can I participate? How do I participate? And it also, I think, oftentimes provides a context for learning. If students are used to a certain activity, they're used to, especially with English language learners, if they're used to where the key information is, or they're used to, a certain type of way that information is presented, it helps them to understand things more because it provides that structure so they know, they're able to pick the important things out of the fluff. For example, if the instructor has given them an outline and knows what, and then so they know kind of the structure and what's going to happen. But I've noticed that, at least for a lot of teachers, because I also work with pre-service teachers, ESL teachers, and one of the things I've noticed is that they've had to make a lot of changes to their routines because they've been doing things online. I mean, if you've got a class full of 30 sixth graders and 4 of them are ESL, and you might say bring them in and do a reading group with them while everybody else is doing silent reading or something. How do you then do that online when you've got they're all on their own in Zoom or something, right? And what changes do you make to those types of routines? Because a lot of the routines that they use are those kind of managing students' physical space and and their placement in the room and those types of things. So how do you change those routines then to fit what you're doing online? And I think that's where and things like assessment and other things that you would normally do a certain way, how do you rethink that then for for the online space? So that's something that I've seen a lot of teachers having to struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think when that structure that kind of you're talking about is been really comforting for some of my students who, especially if they've just arrived in the US recently as English language learners, and they're used to maybe a little bit more teacher directed classroom, and me holding like a weekly Q&A session like I tried over the spring, just that didn't work for them. And they didn't really have maybe models of participation, and I wasn't able to put those up in time and maybe kind of explain how the expectations for this kind of environment. So I think for me, building in more structure into that live session was really important. It seems to be working pretty well so far from the feedback I've gotten.
Tim, you and I have talked about this several times about, when you're looking at an in-person class that's moving to this high flex model, like what do you then make asynchronous and what do you make synchronous? Um, in an ESL setting, like an immersion setting, teaching in the US, a lot of students can go out, well, I don't know if they can go out now, but
Mhm.
they can interact in English, for example, in other settings besides the classroom. But if I'm teaching in a foreign language setting where I'm in a non-English speaking country, and all my students are, especially like when I taught in Korea, everybody speaks Korean, not English. The only time they're really speaking English is in my classroom.
Right.
So I really want to utilize that class time to get them to produce and use the language, right? Um, and so what can I then move out of the classroom that maybe I would do in classroom because it's easy when everybody's there to do something, and and then utilize that time for conversations, or having them do work in groups, or those types of things that get them speaking and using that language, right? So looking at, say, what you might normally do, and then figuring out what needs to be asynchronous and what needs to be synchronous, because now you've got to use your resources differently. So that's another part, I think, of that classroom management.
And I feel like that's probably one of the main struggles that myself and I think other teachers probably have, is looking at what are those critical points, where there's language learning, where that interaction takes place, that are really important for that live session that you're talking about, Justin. I think that's kind of something that maybe we haven't done so much in face to face, where we're just like, oh yeah, we have the liberty of having this class that meets X times amount a week, so it's kind of a given that they're going to interact and language learning is going to take place. But now you have to really rethink design for those synchronous sessions. So yeah, I think that's kind of the hard task that a lot of us have ahead of us.
Yeah, I think there's an important conversation to have there about when I'm working with a faculty member to design a hybrid course, which is kind of what we're talking about with synchronous or high flex. It's kind of founded on that hybrid foundation. But you're right, that conversation about what is that mix of synchronous and asynchronous, and sometimes it helps to frame it from a perspective of what's the foundation and what's the add-on. What, and a lot of times, depending on the background of the instructor or the way that they've taught a course before, the traditional in-person lecture discussion and then go away to do homework is kind of the foundation, and then the asynchronous piece is an add-on to that. And I often find that if we can approach it the other way, if we can develop it as if we were developing an online course, and then let the synchronous sessions be the add-on. Develop it as if it were an online course that's primarily asynchronous, and then let the class sessions, the real-time discussion, the debates, role play, whatever happens in those synchronous sessions, let that be the supplement. Let that be the extra thing, and it just changes the mindset of the idea that I have to do the lecture in person, or that I have to give the exam in person, or that I have to do these things that I used to do in person. But you're right, Randy, there's probably much more that can be done asynchronously, so that the time that we do have together, and I think it's about really amplifying that time that we have with our students. I think a lot of synchronous time that we have with our students can go to waste if we're using it for disseminating announcements, or if the students are sitting quietly at their tables doing a quiz or a test. All those things that we've shown can be very effective in online asynchronous classes. Why do those when they're there? Why waste that time that way? Let's enhance that time and really get the value out of that time, especially right now where time together is much harder. And as I'm working with faculty here, getting ready for fall and what we're calling ASU Sync, and thinking about social distancing, thinking about mask requirements, thinking about microphones on instructors and how will we hear the students. And, I think that synchronous portion is just getting a little bit harder because of all those things, all those little things, needing to wear a mask and be mic'd. What's the right way to mic a lapel on a mask? Do you mount it on the mask? Does it, all these different things are just going to make that synchronous session just a little bit harder. I mean, it's a small thing. Being a little bit farther away from your students is going to be just a little bit harder. And so I think, and Enjoya alluded to this or mentioned this a couple weeks back of, as the synchronous session gets harder, it's important for us to make sure that we're using it better.
Right.
you know?
Well, another thing to that too is the time. So, when we were doing everything remote and, I'm working from home, Tim, you're working from home, I'm on Zoom. It seems like, a lot of time and it's a different skill, I guess, the way that I pay attention in a Zoom call and right. And so, you have Zoom fatigue, I think is the term that people have been using. So even with the in-person sessions that are synchronous, and with the sync model, you might have some students attending via Zoom. You might have some students attending, in person, some students attending asynchronously. But now, what can you do? What can you take out of that to then shorten the synchronous session? So number one, you reduce that Zoom fatigue, but then number two, you might also then be able to start doing things like rotating, right? Where you maybe are only teaching 5 students at a time, but instead of teaching them for an hour, you're doing 20 minutes. And then you do another students for another 20 minutes, 5 students for 20 minutes, and another 5 students for 20 minutes. And you've got your 15 students that you normally would have, but now you're getting them for 20 minutes and you're allowing for that social distancing and whatnot.
Right.
But you've kind of boiled down your synchronous to the key components that they need to be doing, and you're not just trying to fill an hour of class time.
Yeah, I like that approach of distributing that experience, and if you can condense it and focus it so that only what happens in person is very valuable. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I had a quick question maybe for both of you. Going off that, if you do have, let's say you had 2 different synchronous sessions where you had to kind of rotating people in and out, and then you maybe didn't have, let's say you had like a sector of students for whatever reason couldn't attend those. Have you guys had discussions with faculty about what kind of substitute you might make for that material you're creating or presenting through that synchronous session? Because I'm kind of curious about how that process kind of works, and maybe what are some tools or approaches you guys might be advising teachers on using.
Yeah, we just had a long conversation about this a couple days ago. This kind of alternative assessment for those that were only asynchronous students. In the case of the web design class I was mentioning before, it's a skills-based class, and the assessments and things that they're doing are mostly project work and online. So I'm not really assessing anything in the synchronous sessions. I'm answering questions and providing help, but I'm not actually assessing did they learn something, because I'm going to get that from somewhere else. So one of the, maybe, I don't know if it's the best approach, but one effective approach that we came up with was, move all of your assessments to the, so that you're not assessing, you're either not assessing them in the synchronous sessions, or your assessments are built in a way that they work both synchronously and asynchronously, so you're not having to design the alternatives. Maybe having, if students are, for example, summarizing the chapter they've read in a small group, then maybe the asynchronous students are writing a summary and submitting that, and it's the same type of assessment, just a different format. So as much as you can, kind of keeping those two things the same. But
yeah, and if you can,
where that doesn't work, then
yeah, and if you can, just keep them exactly the same. For example, so Justin's example of if there's a Q&A or some kind of think, pair, share, or group interaction in the live session, and they're giving feedback, reporting out, maybe have them report out in the discussion board, so that then the asynchronous people can report out in the same discussion board. And so if you can think of some things that way, so that you're not duplicating your work, you're not saying, well, everyone can go this same path, even if they're doing it at the same time or asynchronously. But you're right, Randy, that developing that alternate activity is sometimes the hardest part of HighFlex. a lot of people are really focused right now on how do I deal with physical and virtual students at the same time, and not really yet processing the fact that there's also going to be this third rail that is the harder thing of how do I give the asynchronous student the same experience or a equivalent experience, and sometimes that involves a new activity, a new discussion board, or a reflection journal, or something else that allows them to engage and process and share the same way that the synchronous students got to engage and process and share. So yeah, you're right. That's the challenge. As much as possible, I like to find a solution that works for both, for all, but there will be times where if students that are choosing that asynchronous path will have to do a different thing. And that becomes a challenge in the gradebook as well, when you have some people doing some activities and some people doing other activities, and how do you track that? It wasn't much of an answer, was it? It was more of an acknowledgement of the challenge.
Yeah. No, those are good thoughts, though. I appreciate it, because I think that's something definitely that we're going to be talking about here in the next couple of weeks within my department.
We had a big discussion the other day also about attendance in that same light of, do you give credit for attendance? How do you track and mark attendance when you have people engaging in such a variety of ways? And so that was an interesting, the same kind of thing of, do they do something online that marks their attendance? Do they, what does that look like? Or do you just not worry about attendance and just have an assessment that assesses their engagement with the material, regardless of how they engaged? So all the same kind of conversation.
Randy, you asked specifically about tools, and one of the things that I think it was Tim brought up in our conversation we had a couple days ago was a lot of teachers forget that their students have access to devices and things in the classroom. So if you have an asynchronous tool, a Padlet or discussion board or whatever it is that you're using, and then you say to your in-person students and your synchronous students, all right, get out your phone, go on here, post your response, or add it to a Google Doc, whatever it is, and then letting the asynchronous students do the same thing, because now they're accessing it through technology, just not at the same time, right? So there are a lot of things that you can do in classroom that also allow your asynchronous students to participate. But a lot of teachers have to get over this idea of, okay, everybody put your phones away, and now it's kind of the exact opposite. Everybody needs to bring their devices with them, or, and if you're accessing it, say, synchronously, do you need to use a phone? Do you need to use a laptop or something? What's the best way for them to participate while they're on Zoom, while they're, that kind of a thing. And kind of thinking about that and planning it out ahead of time so that you're prepared. Maybe you have students getting out their phones, joining the Zoom call, so then they can bring synchronous attending students into a group discussion that they're having, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those are just some things that you just kind of have to think about a little differently. And a lot of it's going to be I think a challenge, especially for professors in higher ed. I mean, language teachers, in my general experience, most of them seem to be kind of open to those types of technology things. I met a few that are still, I would consider Luddites, but professors, especially who for maybe them, teaching is not the main thing they do, and having to overcome that idea of, now they're going to be using their devices in the classroom. I think that's going to be interesting to see this fall.
Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about Nearpod and using that as for interaction in real time. Randy, can students log into the Nearpod after the fact? So could your asynchronous students that were maybe watching a recording also log into the Nearpod and leave their comments and add to those polls and things like that?
Yeah, there is kind of an asynchronous version of it. So you can either do the live course or what they call the student paced version. Mm-hmm. I'm still playing around with that. I've only had a couple weeks using the platform, but I think that could be something where it's like, here's the link to our session. Now you go and do the activities. But part of the problem I had with that when I tried it with one student who didn't show up to my live class was that, having a live class, you're giving the extra context within that. So it's like, do they need to go and watch the entire lesson before they go and try it? And is it still equivalent? So I'm trying to figure out if that's a good substitute for them not being in the class. And then what other context instruction do they need that I gave during the class? And if it's a whole video and they have bandwidth issues, like, is that the best option for them? So it brings up some other questions that I haven't figured out yet.
Lately, I've been liking the idea of a quiz that as a like an exit ticket, or as a just a acknowledgement of participation kind of thing. Of maybe it has some substantive questions about the content that was discussed, but you'd have to really know what your discussion was going to be covering ahead of time to have it kind of in place. But maybe it's also a quiz of, after today, I feel, rank myself out of 1 out of 10 on how my confidence in this area, or one question I still have, or, something like that. That's a little bit open-ended. That's a little bit more of a survey or an instructor, feedback kind of thing. And then students could do that either in the moment as they're participating in the synchronous session. They could do that, if they didn't bring a device to class, as they leave, they could go to a lab or go home and complete the, completion activity. Maybe completion activity is what we call it. But then that same exact activity would be available for people watching the video. And if you took the video from the session and then just embedded it into the quiz, like in Canvas, you have a rich text editor, you can embed instructions in the top of a quiz, or you can even embed a video right into the quiz question. If you even took the recording of your synchronous session and broke it up and put those segments along with the question that went with them, now your students your asynchronous students are responding in the same place and responding, kind of in line with those things. And I'd like to play with that a little bit more in an actual course development. Right now, it's all just in my head. But to kind of integrate that idea that I'm using a quiz to not track attendance, but just log attendance and log participation. And if I can use one tool that logs participation for all 3 tracks of participation, then that's great. That's, not having to produce a whole separate alternative.
Well, go ahead, Randy.
Oh, I was just going to say that, that's the attendance. It is one of the issues that we struggle with as language teachers because of visa issues. We have to be able to show that students are attending our class in whatever means. I'm not sure how all that works for if a student is not physically in the classroom, but in the country, how you're doing that. So I think that's something that we're still figuring out too.
Yeah, I know international students, maybe this is what you're alluding to too. International students have different requirements about what kind of courses they can take.
Yeah. In fact, totally unrelated in a way, but in Arizona, Governor Ducey just had to sign an executive order that disconnected state school funding to number of students in the classroom for fall, because most school districts are offering either a hybrid model or a total remote model in addition to in-person models. So are the schools then getting less funding because they have fewer students in their classroom, but they're being told to social distance, right?
Right.
They just disconnected the funding from
That's actually really great. I mean, that's gonna allow a whole new level of innovation for school districts, because most of my experience is California, but California schools were funded based on what was referred to as ADA, average daily attendance. And so, there was so much push to get students to attend at least the first, and there's some minimum, like how many hours or how many periods they had to attend to be counted as attending that day, for budget reasons. And that was one of the challenges when online learning started coming of, how do we how do we mark ADA? How do we still get funded if our students aren't attending, if we can't count attendance on campus? And one book I was reading, it was interesting, was talking about, all the redundancy that happens in education. Like, you have, any one town might have 5 high schools, and any of those high schools has maybe 3 chemistry teachers. And do we really need 8, 5 times 3, 15 different teachers teaching the same thing, all kind of in parallel and redundantly? Or can we have one, great chemistry teacher where all the students join virtually to that person, and then another person that can focus on biochem or focus on a different specialty? Same idea with like what schools can offer what languages based on what staff they have and things like that. And if my school doesn't have French, but I want to learn French, can I take it remotely from the neighboring school? And the big hangup was not the technology or the teacher's willingness to teach remotely. It was, how do I get paid for that student that didn't come to my school? And that was the hangup. And so it'll be interesting to see post COVID if some of these things carry through, because we've in the process have addressed and solved some of those other logistical problems.
Yeah, and often comes down to money. One of the things I was thinking of as you were talking, Randy and Tim, was like, we have these 3 modalities: in person, synchronous but remote, and then asynchronous. But I'm thinking, well, even let's say I have 10 students that are all coming in person, and I might have the rest are asynchronous, so I have no remote students. But I think there's still a need for me to record my class, right? So get on a Zoom call and use the recording, or record it in some way, but then I'm providing that video of the class to the asynchronous students. So in the Nearpod example you were showing us, if you've got the video that shows the code and everything, and then they're going on and participating in the Nearpod and following along as you're doing your video, then they're theoretically they're getting all the same context and whatever that your in-person students got. But if you didn't know that you had if you said, oh, I don't have any students who are attending remotely but synchronous, you might not think to do some of those things. I think that's really important, to make sure that you're capturing all of the things that the context you gave and the announcements and instructions, whatever it is, you're capturing all that for those asynchronous students, however you end up doing that. You might not have to get on Zoom, you may have a different way to record it, just a webcam recording onto your computer in QuickTime or something, but then you're making that video available. So you still captured all that stuff that went on. So.
Yeah, and developing those routines is important. And having that concept of, I think a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at Michael Wesch, he was talking about that concept of kind of instant video or throwaway video. And I treat those kind of, any kind of capture of a live event, I kind of treat it as a throwaway video. It's not something that I'm going to reuse I'm not going to say, well, I've captured that lecture now I can just put that in my online class. That's not an appropriate instructional video for an online class, but it is a valid capture of an event. It's a resource that way. And so thinking of those as much more kind of informal recordings, not worrying quite as much about the recording quality, but it has to be good enough is good enough in those cases. And I used to that's one of the things I really liked about Google Hangouts, was that you could it would capture and record and then post straight to YouTube. So as soon as your Hangout was done, like it had to process a little bit, but within a half hour I had a link and I could shoot an email out to the students and say, here's the recording from tonight's class. I taught night classes mostly. And so I would, by the time I, stopped recording, packed up the stuff, talked to the students that were still hanging around a little bit, I could usually distribute the link before I left the classroom and did the drive home. And so it was just kind of a part of the routine. It was just everything was captured, everything was recorded, and the students, even the students that showed up in class, enjoyed having that ability to go back and review. It took the pressure off to take copious notes, and if you wanted to be reminded. I remember you said something. How did you phrase that? Or, what was that example you gave? I can go back to the recording and find it rather than saying, well, did anyone write that down? And so, yeah, just doing those informal recordings, those archival kind of things can be really valuable, not only for your remote, for your asynchronous students, even sometimes for your in-person classes. And that's a strategy that I've carried forward into a lot of the other things that I do. Even if I don't know that there's going to be a need for it, if there's no reason not to record it, like if it's not a private conversation, if it's not, like some kind of, internal information, might as well record it. There, even, some of the course design meetings I have with faculty, sometimes I'll record them and then just share that back to them. Hey, here's the recording from today's meeting, so that you can be reminded what we talked about. Just working in that workflow. Zoom is great for that. Like I said, I really enjoyed Hangouts, even though it's not really around anymore. But finding that workflow that is sustainable is really important. It's really hard. I find it hard when I do a local recording, because now I have to process that. If I feel the little bit of pressure to edit it, whereas with Hangouts, it always was what it was. I couldn't edit it if I wanted to. And so that relieved me from the pressure to having to think about editing it. If I do a screen grab with QuickTime, now I have to host it somewhere. I have to put it to my YouTube channel, or I have to put it in my Google Drive or something like that. So if your school has those tools like Zoom, Randy, you mentioned that I think your school has Panopto. Just, develop those habits of and that expectation that you're going to record class, and make it available, especially if you have a service like those where bandwidth is unlimited. And with Panopto, you just turn on your screen recording and then turn it off at the end. It records straight to the server. Then those are good habits to get into as well.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Randy, and then Justin.
I was just going to say, I really appreciate, that sharing the Michael Welsh video. It's made a big difference in kind of freeing me from those expectations of that I have to be, perfectly edited, because I do have that tendency to want to, all right, now I'm going to cut out the ums or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so once I got over that, I felt like that was really helpful for my routine. So I just want to say thanks for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and on that note about the ums and whatnot, that's actually, when I'm doing, because I've done several courses where I was the video producer, for the editor for the professionally done videos. And mm-hmm. we left a lot of those types of things in there because they add that kind of personalized, personal feeling and that warm language, as we call it. Yeah, I would say you don't need to worry about taking it. The only time I've actually edited a course video or one of my videos is I accidentally showed because I did a screen share and I had some personal information on the screen. It's like, I don't want that to be in the recording.
Right.
So I cut that part out. But the other thing too, at least with Zoom, or you don't even have to use Zoom to do this, but you could stream your live session that you're doing to YouTube Live, right? So people can get it on YouTube Live, but then YouTube Live also automatically records and processes it for you, and then it's available on your YouTube channel. Because so there are other ways that you could, even if you're doing Zoom and recording locally or something, you can still get that recording and stream it that way.
I think that's one of the next things for me to kind of play with. We started a Facebook group for this office hours group. And if you go to the Facebook group, you can see a video that Randy made. I haven't watched it yet, Randy, but you just posted it earlier today. So you can go check that out. But I know that Zoom has that ability to stream, like you said, to YouTube or to also Facebook. And then it does that automatic capture like you were talking about. And that's what, we referred back to earlier about Alex Lindsay's office hours meeting, and that's what they do. They just stream to YouTube and capture that, and so there's no process. There's no back end process of now I have to manage all these files and I have to and so that might be something to think about. There are probably some. We'd have to look at what kind of FERPA issues there might be as far as streaming a class session,
especially in a K-12 setting.
especially in that setting. I noticed the other day when I was uploading something to YouTube that there were like check boxes that say, does your video include any children? Does it,
Yeah.
they're kind of guiding people because they've probably been burned in a couple of ways. But things to think about if it's just you, and your school might have rules about this, about if a student's voice can be recorded without a waiver, or if they're,
Mhm.
where the camera. But you can sometimes think about where you're setting your camera, or it might just be a part of your syllabus that they're acknowledging that I understand that class sessions are being recorded and streamed, and so that could be a thing. But yeah, that's something that might be a little bit more a sustainable practice, is to use that streaming feature in Zoom to stream to some service that is then recording it in real time. I had to check into that.
Well, and I, I've, I mean, I've done this for English language learners where, I mean, a lot of professors, and I can't remember if this is an ASU policy or not. A lot of professors won't let you record in the classroom. Like, you have to ask for permission to record, right?
Yeah.
But it's a key strategy for second language learners or ESL students,
Mm-hmm.
because then they can go back and listen to it, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know, there might be some use case where you're, providing a video as an accommodation for an ADA compliance or something like that. So I think in the future, even just recording in-person classes, um, might be a useful thing, to have that video,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you'll have asynchronous students. But even for those that were in person,
Right.
the second language learners don't catch everything the first time. Half the students might not be paying attention, and so they don't catch it the first time either.
Well, yeah, there's research to show that we all, only absorb whatever percentage, I can't think of it off the top of my head, of what we're hearing. Even when it's just the three of us talking and I, look up here to check what time it is, or,
Mm-hmm.
I'm missing things. And so, yeah, that's a great practice to get into, of just, if you can do it in such a way that doesn't add a lot of back end work, if you're not having to download, process, upload, post, if you're not adding 10 more steps to your life, but you're adding one step that's, hit the record button and then hit it again at the end, then that could be like you said, an incredibly valuable thing. And I've had international students tell me that this made the class so much easier because the recording was always there. Yep.
Yeah.
You're muted, Randy.
I feel like that kind of ties in with the UDL kind of +1 approach. I think, Tim, you mentioned that, and I'm sure you have too, Justin. Just like I'm trying to get some of my fellow teachers to kind of think a little bit more about universal design for learning concepts and approaches, because especially international students and all students, I think, really need that as they've moved online, is like trying to add that +1 other way to make sure they have choices for getting content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like it. Well, I've got to start getting ready for my next meeting. So we'll wrap it up here. What I'd like to do, I want to ask you guys a question. I mentioned earlier about maybe changing the format of the office hours away from kind of starting the conversation based on a resource and maybe having it just be more Q&A driven. What are your thoughts about that?
I like having some type of topic as focus, even if it kind of goes off.
Mm-hmm.
And so I still like having some resource that conversation goes around, even if I didn't actually read this one or the right one this time.
But the one you watched is great too.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, Tim, you post what you're going to talk about before we talk about it in Slack, and you're probably doing this on Facebook too, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like as a faculty member, I think if I were seeing that and say, "Oh, well, that really interests me. I want to make sure I join," right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why we don't get more people joining those. It's probably because Slack is our distribution channel, but but that really gives me something to look forward to and anticipate.
Mm-hmm.
Know if I want to participate or not. So I like that, and I like having it around a theme. So I would say, yeah. I mean, when you do just Q&A, you also might get kind of a variety.
Right.
Then somebody going back and saying, well, I wanted to participate, but I couldn't at that time. Now they're having to go through the recording, kind of
Right.
see what they can find versus
Okay.
knowing that it's about a topic. So
Cool.
I think that the topic provides the focus, and I would keep doing it that way.
Sounds good. Well, and I think it's important. A lot of what I do, and one of the reasons that we started this project was not just to facilitate the conversation like we talked about before in the professional development, but to also model some flipped instruction and to model some remote instruction, and that idea that putting a topic out, putting a video out, an article or something like that, and then using that synchronous time to talk about it. Rather than having this really be a webinar where one of us is presenting, let the direct instruction happen ahead of time and let this just really be a conversation, and then it can go where it needs to go, and I'm happy with that too. So I'm glad to hear that my instinct echoes with both of you. So that's good. So I will go ahead and throw out the topic for next week right now for anyone that's watching, and for Randy and Justin. I still want to stick to this idea of video production. And I think that's something that, because we're all learning to teach remote, we're all learning to teach, and this idea that I still think that pre-recording your direct instruction portions is incredibly valuable. Whether you have remote students, or even if, like we've talked about today, if you just are going to play it in class. I've done that before with my middle school students, where I recorded myself teaching the lesson or giving the instructions, and then I just played it on the screen in class. It's amazing how much better the students listen to me on the screen than they actually listen to me in person. Again, but it saved my voice in a school where I was teaching the same lesson 8 times a day. That was incredibly beneficial. It made sure that everyone was getting the same instructions, all that kind of stuff. And so I still think that video production and instructor-created video has a lot of value. So what I'd like for next week is if people could look out on YouTube and look at search for instructional video in your content area. So if you're a music teacher, look at how people are teaching music. If you're a math teacher, look at how people are teaching math, and maybe come back with an example that you think you'd like to emulate, and say, I really liked how this person did that. I suppose the other side of that is you could come back with some negative examples too. Those are often funnier, but not always the best to model from. So that's a place to start of how are people doing this? How are people already doing this? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to figure out how other people did. And like learning from Alex, and like learning from the gamers, the streamers that are engaging their audience while they're playing video games. How are they doing that? Those things like that. I think there's a lot to learn from different areas. So that would be my challenge for next week, is kind of look around on YouTube, find instructional video in your content area that you think is something that you'd like to emulate. Post it in our Slack channel, or if you're on the Facebook group, post it in the Facebook group, or just bring the link with you next week, and we can talk about that and kind of talk about what are they doing, how are they getting that view, or what tools are they using, and things like that. So again, with the goal that we're all just kind of slowly upping our own game in engaging our audience, engaging our students, and the level of instruction that we're able to produce.
Cool. I look forward to it.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Randy and Justin. It's always great to have you here. If you're watching on YouTube or you're watching somewhere else, look in the description below to get the link if you'd like to join. We have this conversation every Thursday at 1 p.m., and you're free to join and bring your own voice to the conversation as well. So see you next time.